Last week, we learned about some of the historical references and current implications of anti-Semitism. We heard about the politics of hatred, and we gained essential elements that will help guide our thinking around anti-Semitism and bigotry. So join us as we continue our conversation with Dr. Melinda Menzer and Scott Auspelmyer.
Thank you all so much for hanging out with us for part two. And Scott, you mentioned something in an email to me, and I know this is not in the questions, but I just have you because you mentioned something about a hyphen.
Mm-hmm.
As I've been reading the script today, I noticed that even as I was writing some things down, I'm flipping from anti-Semitism being one word to having a hyphen. So before I ask this next question, can you explain and help me understand a little bit?
Yes, anti-Semitism now is all one word. There is no, scholars are using only as one word as opposed to it being hyphenated. And there are a variety of reasons for this. And I can't speak to all the reasons. I can tell you that much right now. But one of the factors is, quite frankly, Semitism itself is referring to Semitic languages, not a people necessarily. And so it's not really accurate to say anti-Semitism if really what you mean is anti-Jewish people. And so part of it was, I think, the attempt to have one word everybody knows is referencing anti-Jewish people. Scholars committing to that. The reality is, most often still to this day, you're going to see it hyphenated. And so I think that'll be clarified a little bit further, and there are other articles out there that you can find certainly online about that, the differences there. And honestly, for me, even though I've been teaching it for a long time, all the historical works that I have been using have it hyphenated. And it was only in the past really year where I started to come to recognize that it was all one word. It may be something interesting for your listeners to look into, and if you're really interested in etymology and how words evolve, that might be interesting to them.
Well, Holland, this is the conversation of the future of words, so we really appreciate this. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that little segue. I appreciate it because that was fascinating to me. So first of all, let me ask you this, Scott. What motivates, feeds, or exacerbates anti-Semitism?
I touched on in the previous episode on fear being a key motivating factor. I really would extend that to fear of the unknown. Let's think about just present day, what's happening right now with this pandemic. And some states are reopening in a variety of ways. Some states are very still much clamping down and locking down and that sort of thing. And people are coming out on all sides, especially if you follow social media, on this particular issue. Some people saying, no, we must reopen. There's protests about that. Others being very cautious and saying, we can't, you're risking too many things. And all of this stems from this fear that we don't know what's going to happen. We can't predict it. We want to be able to be reassured that it's going to be one way or another. And no matter how you feel about the government's actions or inactions, the reality is we still don't know. Even if they had a plan, some people may say they don't or they do. We don't really know what's going to happen. And so I think it's that fear of the unknown that's really catalyst for people to lash out at others. And so we see that happening right now. People are lashing out, those who are protesting, protesters who are lashing out at government entities, keeping them from going this way. And so I think that is a key aspect for what happens with anti-Semitism as well. When you have these unstable times, it leads to people looking for other people to blame for those issues and for those problems. And so whether it's the bubonic plague several hundred years ago, or whether it's the Great Depression, casualties of war, whatever it might be, historically speaking, Jews have been a minority in many of the countries that suffered through these things, and they were an easy target. And a lot of very easy target because they also had, because they were following a different religion than everybody else in the state or country in which they lived in. And so they'd always been a target, and now it just flared up even more so because of the problems that everybody's facing. So they want to blame somebody for these problems because they don't know what's going to happen. They're scared, essentially.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that idea of the fear of the unknown and wanting someone to blame. And you've seen that over and over, that historical narrative has come out again and again. So seeing it again now makes perfect sense. Thanks for sharing that, Scott. How about you, Melinda?
Well, I would really emphasize what Scott said about fear and about a desire to make sense of the world. to understand that there are secret forces that are causing all of your problems, and if you could locate them, then you could fight them. And people who talk about recruiting others to white supremacist and anti-Semitic groups talk about using that technique, right? So in an example I recently heard, a young man doesn't have a girlfriend. Well, why doesn't he have a girlfriend? And this former recruiter spun a long story about how the Jews are promoting images of Black men as the male ideal, and for that reason, girls are no longer interested in white men like you, and it's not your fault. Here you have someone to blame. That is a technique that is being used by people who are recruiting both online and in person. When I think of my own family's history, when I think of the world that they lived in early 40s, late 30s, Lithuania, they had been living in a community side by side with Protestants and Catholics for generations. But in that case, again, it was a time of great upheaval. There was economic uncertainty. It was the time of the Great Depression. Lithuania had been invaded by the Soviet Union and now was being invaded again by Nazi Germany. People didn't have enough to eat. My own great-grandfather had gone bankrupt shortly before the Nazi invasion. So at a time of uncertainty, of fear, of poverty, it is relatively easy then to convince people to identify an enemy and act against it. In the case of my family's Holocaust history, right, you hand out the alcohol and the guns and you say, there's your enemy. Those are the people to blame. It is because in times like those, perhaps we might say, times like these, that people are so susceptible to anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred that we really must work all the time in advance in times of prosperity to prepare us for the times when it will be all too easy for other people to try to tell us who to blame and who to punish.
Wow, those are just some hard things to hear, but obviously very powerful. And I appreciate those words. Thank you for sharing.
Well, we've talked a little bit about different kinds of anti-Semitism, and some of the things that you've mentioned are pretty dark and frightening. What do you think are the possibilities of a large-scale genocide of Jewish people happening in our time?
I don't think there's a great possibility. My reasons for that are both optimistic and somewhat cynical. On one hand, you would think that we had learned something the first time, and then perhaps more cynically, it would just be a whole lot harder to pull off in the 21st century. Jews are much more widely dispersed. There just aren't that many of us. My real fear is more of the pogrom-style violence of the late 19th century. So it's not a situation where you have a machine put in place to murder millions and millions of people, but instead you have vigilantes who are winked at by authorities promoting violence. I think that's something that sadly I do worry about in these times, an acceleration of the sort of thing that we saw at Tree of Life, at Poway. And, I would absolutely include the murders in Charleston at Mother Emanuel. In a society where people are angry and scared and armed, well, that's a society that has got a lot of strikes against it. So I guess I am not so concerned about sort of a large-scale genocide. I am more concerned about violence And not just violence against Jews, but also, as we have seen, violence against immigrants, violence against Black Americans, violence against Muslim Americans, perpetuated by individuals with large arsenals who are willing to die in their attacks. That was very grim. I'm sorry.
It's not grim, Melinda. In some ways, I think it is realistic. I actually have personal experience with a family when they moved from South Florida to California, legally changed their last name. And this was probably over 20 years ago. And they just wanted to not have a Jewish sounding name. Yes. So it's not, I don't think you're being grim. I think, unfortunately, there's enough of a fear out there that it's that realistic need.
Yes. Things that Christian churches do without thinking, for instance, certain kinds of advertising about when their services take place or how you can access clergy. Those are things that Jews don't do. And we have for years, I mean, long before the massacre or the murders at Tree of Life Synagogue, we have for years had certain security procedures in place at any synagogue I've been a member of, procedures developed by the Anti-Defamation League and other organizations. Since, of course, the Tree of Life Synagogue, we have had armed security at every service and every religious school session until we went virtual. And it does something to a person to see an armed guard, at the door every time you go in for Friday night services. The feeling that violence is possible at any time and that we cannot rely on the government to protect us, that we must have our own security. I never thought as an American that we would be in this place.
Thank you for sharing, Melinda. How about you, Scott?
In terms of the question about large-scale genocide on the level of the Holocaust against Jewish people, again, I would agree with Melinda. I don't think this is a possibility for a variety of reasons, but I tend to be a little more optimistic in terms of, I do have a cynical side, but in terms of, I'm very optimistic that there are enough people who would be so vehemently opposed to such an event that they would compel their governments to act out against such an event from happening. But I also would agree with Melinda that the instances of, small localized violence and what I would refer to as domestic terrorism is a lot more likely, I would say. Maybe not guaranteed, but a lot more likely to happen. And I think that the bigger threat in America, as far as terrorism is concerned, is not terrorism from foreigners. I think we've done a very effective job since 9/11, especially with Homeland Security, to clamp down on that. But I think domestic terrorism is a whole new level of a challenge there. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But those would be my fears, more of those localized incidences becoming more common, in the same way that gun violence has become more common, in the same way that school shootings have become more common. I mean, I think it's really disturbing, as a teacher myself, just the thought of after every school shooting, going back to school every day, it's just, at different points in time, I was scared, and I know the students were scared, and then to think that there are people in America who can't even go to their own religious institution without being fearful that potentially that institution could be attacked. It should bring it home that you have to have armed guards at a synagogue. That is very disturbing.
Well, you mentioned a little bit of this, both of you, Melinda and Scott, but what are some subtle ways that anti-Semitism shows itself? You touched base with it a little bit, Scott, in your opening on our last episode, just subtle questions. And Melinda, you talked about it when your students said, hey, the one thing we can agree on is the Holocaust was bad. But what are some ways that people show anti-Semitic behavior without maybe meaning to? Maybe it's that, okay, I do think I'm educated. I do think that I'm wanting to do the right thing, but how are we stepping into it? Even Something even as simple as putting a hyphen in anti-Semitism.
I would say language is the most common way that I see it happen. Whether it's, a news story, like on the nightly news or something like that. For example, use of the word Jew as an adjective that could be perceived as disparaging, even if not intended that way. So let's hypothetically say there's a Jewish person that is a banker that commits fraud, and maybe a news story is reporting on this. A reporter is just stating the facts, and the facts often will be not a banker committed fraud, but a Jewish banker committed fraud. The reality is that whether he's Jewish or not should not play any role in terms of the act or crime that he committed. But the attachment of that adjective to describe that person further is a form of anti-Semitism. We may not even pick up on it. And I think that's the biggest challenge with those sorts of instances. When we bring up the word, or words regarding Jews and things of that nature, I think people don't even necessarily recognize that what they are saying is actually discriminatory. And there are lots of words that we've used that become common language. If you use the phrase Russian roulette, you're implying that Russian culture is fatalistic in some way, shape, or form. If you say, oh man, I got gypped, that's, so the way we use language, I think sometimes we don't even recognize because we grew up and this is just common. And I think that's a very difficult thing. But we have to remember, I think most importantly, is that yes, the perspective of the person who's speaking is important, but the perspective of the person who is listening is ultimately more important, because how they perceive it is really what is most important. And so what we say and how we say it and how we write, or what we write and how we write it is important. And sometimes these are the predecessors to hateful action. Hateful language is the predecessor to hateful action.
Melinda, I have a feeling this taps right into your wheelhouse as a linguist.
Yes, thinking about language and thinking about the things that we say to each other and the ways in which we say them to each other, I think is very important. As Scott was speaking, I was thinking about my children's experience of anti-Semitism, growing up in a good-sized city in South Carolina, where for both of their educations, and they've both been educated exclusively in public schools in South Carolina, they were not just the only Jewish child in their class or the only Jewish child in their grade. They were frequently the only Jewish child in the school, the only Jewish person in the building. And the things that were said to them on a regular basis by people was astounding. And I guess just the most common one was how frequently other children would tell them they were going to hell. My younger child was not quite 6 weeks into first grade at a public school or neighborhood public school. We walked to it when another child told him he was going to hell because he didn't believe in Jesus. Now, I am aware that there are people who believe that, and they teach their children that. And I suppose in a way it may be nice for them to know that their children pay attention and they actually repeat it. But the impact on a child to hear that, the first time, my son didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know what hell was. But years and years of that, it has radicalized both of my children, has made them both much more aware of their Jewish identity than I was at their age, because over and over again, they are made to feel other, and other in a very explicitly negative way. One other thing that I wanted to mention, though, in thinking about this question, in my life, the thing that people say to me most frequently is, "That's funny, you don't look Jewish." Now, of course, I look Jewish. I mean, it got to a point in my life where I would just point at my face and say, this is what a Jew looks like. As difficult as that was for me, though, in my identity and my understanding of what it is to be Jewish, it is even more painful and insidious when those sorts of statements are said to Jews of color. Jews live all over the world. Jews come in all different ethnicities and skin colors. And we are all really Jewish. And it is important for people within and without the Jewish community to affirm the identity of other Jews. I think even the very simple things, as Scott was saying, or, you don't look Jewish, doesn't seem like much of an attack. But years and years of it makes a person question her identity in a way that is not productive.
That makes perfect sense. And, we had an episode in our first season talking about propaganda and the power of adjectives. And anytime when that other, it's an us versus them, that otherness is used in a descriptor in any way, obviously is hurtful. And I can definitely understand that. Thank you so much.
Well, we're coming to the end of the conversation, so let's take a little more of a positive turn. What can be done to cure or to prevent anti-Semitism from occurring?
Oh, wow. Cure. I think certainly there's not a cure, so to speak, for any form of discrimination, anti-Semitism included, but certainly there are ways to continue to make progress in minimizing the impacts and the amount of anti-Semitism that exists. And for me being a teacher, obviously I'm going to look to education, obviously, is the key aspect of it, with the younger generations especially, but I think it needs to continue for all generations. We can see multiple examples of this in the past in American history and history of other countries where they have, quote unquote, I guess, evolved in their thinking, and society basically got to a point where they're saying this just isn't right anymore. Whether it's the civil rights movement of the 1960s in terms of African-American rights, into the 70s for women's rights and women's equality. And there are certainly large strides still to be made in those areas, but significant strides have been made. And gay rights, as I mentioned earlier in the previous episode. So people, as we learn and as we become more educated, I think people become more willing to understand the similarities are more important than the differences that exist between people. And so I think that's what we need to really celebrate, is certainly celebrate the diversity and the differences that exist, especially in our country, which is founded, as that kind of a principle of ours that we celebrate the diversity, but don't let that diversity blind us to the reality that we are still humans and we have many more similarities beyond the fact that we're all American or that we're all of a particular nationality.
Right. I mean, I think how Scott began was really important. I don't think we should think of our work against anti-Semitism in terms of a cure. Perhaps one day we will get to a point where anti-Semitism no longer exists. But as I said last week, it was just 4 years ago that I frequently encountered people who told me that anti-Semitism didn't exist, that it no longer existed. I think as well as a strong focus on education, as Scott said, I think it's very important for people at every level to see anti-Semitism and to call it out by name when they see it, to do that with their children, to do that with their students. I wish our leaders would do that with us, to call out, to name it, to say, this is what anti-Semitism looks like. The bad guys aren't going to come in with a big hat that says bad guy on it, right? We need to be able to recognize this evil in all of its forms. And it's for that reason that I would say, again, that we're not thinking so much, as a cure, but thinking more in terms of something like the flu vaccine. You have to get it every year because the flu virus mutates, right? We're not going to inoculate people against anti-Semitism the way we've inoculated people against polio. We have to keep at it in good times and in bad.
And if I could just follow up briefly, I agree 100%. Melinda, you made me think about, this earlier you mentioned the idea that you had heard students say to you, oh, well, we all agree that the Holocaust is bad, but anti-Semitism doesn't exist anymore. I think a big problem that people have is that if they don't feel it personally or see it personally, then it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It's like an out of sight. It's a weird sort of phenomenon, but this whole individual look at things or feeling is probably one of the toughest things for us to combat, but it's also the thing that's most necessary to make it more widely known that these things are still happening. And, sometimes, I've received emails before about this idea that, well, the Holocaust, yes, it happened. Why do you guys kind of keep shoving it in our face? Well, because anti-Semitism still exists. And what's more important is that the Holocaust is a human story. And we need to understand that this isn't just a story about Jews. Yes, it is predominantly a Jewish story, but the reality is this is a story of an event that tells us about humanity, what we can do to each other if we don't focus on the commonalities that we have and the shared humanity that we have, rather than focusing on the individualism and the differences.
If I could just jump in here for a moment. When I talk about my family's Holocaust experience with students, and I will talk to anyone who will have me, so adults as well as high school or middle school students, the thing that I tell them is that it's very easy to think of yourself as a victim, to imagine yourself being a victim. It's very easy, especially for a Jewish person like myself, to imagine herself as a victim. But the true lesson of the Holocaust is how sadly, tragically easy it was for people to become perpetrators and bystanders. And so what we are learning from the Holocaust is not, oh, this tragic event happened to Jews 75 years ago. What we are learning is instruction on how to not become the killers, how to not become the perpetrators. And I think that everything that we say about education has to be based on the idea that we aren't just teaching history. We aren't just talking about the past. We're always talking about right now, what's happening right now.
That's excellent. In our other episode, you talked about working in times of prosperity. Mm-hmm. Scott, I really appreciate your idea of positivity and making our mindset shift in a time when we are not in COVID or some sort of dire need. That's the time. But then Scott's point, our perspective is I don't see it. So if I don't see it, I must not need it. So really excellent thoughts as we think about closing out this episode. And we have a signature question, the Afterword. And you both have been dancing around these metaphors all night and last episode as well. But and I'm not sure who would like to go first. What is a metaphor that would help us understand this topic of anti-Semitism?
I'm going to defer to Melinda here.
As I was just speaking about vaccines and viruses, I really think that is it's a metaphor that is on all of our minds, but I think it is also a very appropriate metaphor that we should think of anti-Semitism as a virus, and a virus that can pop up in different locations with different symptoms in different periods of time. As Scott was noting, we don't think about how dangerous, how how terrifying something like polio was today because a vaccine has eradicated it. Now that we are in a situation where we have a new scary virus, we could learn from the lessons of the past. I think we also have to think of anti-Semitism as a virus that is constantly mutating, that requires us not to think of it as something that can be cured, but something that can be controlled. And that it really takes a whole society, I think it takes a whole world to achieve that. Again, it took decades to achieve the eradication of smallpox. We continue to have to fight against something like polio in small pockets of the world. And I think we should think of anti-Semitism as like that, as a disease that we have to keep fighting, that if we forget about it or think it's no longer there, that is when we are in most danger of becoming susceptible to it. And the very last thing that I would say about how anti-Semitism is like a virus is that it doesn't just hurt the people who are infected. It hurts the entire community. The ripple effect of the deaths and the illnesses of the people who have witnessed trauma, when I think about the effect of the Holocaust on the survivors of the Holocaust and upon their children, its effect is far more reaching than it is to simply to an individual victim, what we might think of as an individual patient. So I think that the idea of anti-Semitism as a virus, as one that we never stop fighting, that we work to prevent as well as to cure, is the one that's really useful for us today.
All right, Scott, you're up.
Okay, and thinking about this question, I actually have maybe a slightly different take, if not a significantly different take on it. I really like the analogy to this idea of a vaccine, but one that has to be continually taken. So I'm going to kind of build off of that a little bit. I think of the myth of Sisyphus, actually. You know, he's condemned to roll that boulder up the hill, and then it, rolls back down, and then he has to do it again. And so I think that's what we maybe need to look at it in a different way, and maybe look at Sisyphus in the process of what he's doing as being in some way, shape, or form worthy, despite the fact that he's condemned to do it. So maybe the boulder is us trying to eradicate anti-Semitism. And maybe every so often we can't do it and it rushes back down the hill. But we need to embrace the reality that we need to continue to push it back up the hill. And we may never get it over the hill to where it's eradicated, but the process of the pushing and the engagement that all of us as a collective have in pushing that boulder in the right direction comes growth and opportunity and eventual reduction and mitigation of anti-Semitism and the impact of it. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of one thing to think about.
Sense, because also when you're pushing that rock, you're also building strength.
Mm-hmm.
And that strength continues, and strength builds strength. So maybe what was hard the first time, the second time pushing the rock, it's going to get better.
Yep, there you go.
Yes, those were both fantastic metaphors. Well, the whole conversation, I mean, I did not expect these kinds of answers. I didn't expect things to go the way that they did, but wow, it's been so good.
Yeah. Well, then we've done our job well, and we didn't ask questions that could just be Googled.
Right. Yeah, that's a goal for us, is to ask questions that our listeners can't Google the answers to. So.
Oh, goodness.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being part of this, Melinda and Scott. This has been just a fascinating conversation to me, because I guess it's something that I've always known was sort of out there, but not something that I knew as intimately as what you've just explained in a little over an hour.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with your listeners.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, like I said, we will definitely connect both the SC Holocaust Council and the charity HIAS. I want to pronounce with the different vowels, but we will definitely connect that information. Before we close, though, Scott, tell us where we can connect, where our listeners can connect with the SC Holocaust organization.
Yes, scholocaustcouncil.org is our website, and we have resources on there, including interviews, Holocaust survivors from South Carolina. And so we are able to digitize those a few years ago, and we have them all there on our website, and other educational resources too, especially for our listeners in South Carolina. We definitely have resources that you should reach out to us if you want any information, or if you want to ever have us come and maybe speak at your organization.
Oh, that sounds very helpful.
Melinda, how can folks get in touch with you if they'd like to have you come and speak?
Oh, well, if you'd like to have me come and speak, you can easily Google me, or you can email me at mmenzer@scholocaustcouncil.org. If you are interested in HIAS, you can go to HIAS.org, which is HIAS.org. And finally, if you're interested in my Swim for HIAS, again, I would say the easiest way is to just Google Swim for HIAS. You can also check out the Facebook page for the most up-to-date information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So join us next week as we talk about grandparents raising grandkids and the stories that help support our communities in this endeavor. And while you wait for that episode, please leave us a review, rate us on iTunes, and become a subscriber to the AfterwordPodcast.com. It does help us keep the conversations going. And as always, remember that you are welcome at our table.